Hi, welcome to this demo of IBM Spectrum Fusion. Today, Ben Randall will be taking you through how you can use the YAML files that are created when you use the user interface to create your backup policies and apply those YAML files to other applications. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ben.
So we're taking a look at IBM Spectrum Fusion version 2.3, and we're going to explore how we can manage backup as code. What I'm going to show you has already been available within Spectrum Fusion, but I'm just doing it with the 2.3 version. Spectrum Fusion, of course, has a user interface. And if I want to go configure, say, something like backup restore, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to create my backup policies, specifying when I want to back up, where I want to store it, how long to keep the backups. I'm going to define connections to object storage. In this case, it looks like I'm using an S3 bucket East, US East. And then it's a matter of going to the applications that I want to back up. In this case, I have Cloud Pak for Data installed, and I have a number of Cloud Pak services, and go ahead and assign a policy. And then I'm going to have my backups run. So that's how I would do things in like a very traditional management UI. But with container environments and container workloads, really, I want to do things in the as code fashion. And what that really means is that as I go into a tool like OpenShift, this is the same OpenShift that's running that Spectrum Fusion, I'm managing all this stuff as code, right? OpenShift itself has a UI, but really I'm using YAML files. I'm basically going to create these files that spell out the state that I desire in the environment. And then Kubernetes is going to work with the Spectrum Fusion operator in order to achieve that state. And so as an example, as I take a look at all of these constructs within Spectrum Fusion's UI, like the backup policies and my backup location, I'm able to actually find that in OpenShift as a YAML file. And so I'm going to go into my installed operators view. I'm going to drill in on IBM Spectrum Fusion, and I see a list of the APIs that Spectrum Fusion exposes through a Kubernetes concept called a custom resource. One of these is a backup storage location. And I can see this one called CPD inst. And you'll notice that is the same name if I go to my locations tab of my cloud backup storage location. And if I take a look at the YAML for CPD, and this is essentially the configuration file that defines it, and I take a look at the specs section, I can see that there is a secret that's being used for the credentials. And then I have my cloud endpoint, which is my S3 storage, and then I have a particular bucket within that cloud endpoint. And you'll notice that that's identical to the information that I see in the UI that is spelling out the endpoint and the bucket. So basically, anytime you create something within the Spectrum Fusion UI, under the covers, we're actually going to create a custom resource that is going to have a YAML that matches the spec. And I'm able to see the status of it in the YAML as well, which is showing that it's connected. And likewise, you're going to be able to see that reflected within the Spectrum Fusion UI for that backup location. So what's the power of this? What's the point of this, and why am I bothering to show it to you? It's because I can take a definition like this YAML I've created, the spec for this YAML. I'm able to check that into, say, my Git repository. And let's say that I'm dealing with 10 different OpenShift clusters. I can use my deployment toolchain to push this file out into all 10 of those OpenShift clusters. And now all 10 of those OpenShift clusters are going to have the definition of this backup storage location, which is basically this Amazon S3 endpoint. They will automatically connect to that bucket that I have specified here. And now I can create backup policies that are all going to point to that bucket. And so if I back up a little bit and go back to our API list, I can see that I have my backup policy. I have two policies defined, CPD ops and CPSD Zen demo policy. Let's go ahead and click in on one of these. And again, I'm going to go to that YAML view. And if I take a look at the spec, it's going to describe how this policy works. If we go back to our UI and I take a look at some policies, we'll remember that a policy is a combination of three things: the frequency of when I want to back up. In this case, it's every first day of the month. when I want that to happen during that day, which is 12 a.m., how long I want to retain the data for 30 days, and then where I'm going to store that backup. And I'm going to be storing that backup in that backup location that we were just looking at. And so if we take a look at this YAML file and we take a look at the spec, you're going to see that same exact information reflected. I have my backup storage location. I have my retention of 30 days, and then I have my schedule, which is being specified in a cron format. So not only can I use the UI to define these backup policies, but I could also define them directly in YAML. But again, the power of this is that I can take the spec from this YAML, I can check it into my Git, and I could use my toolchain to deploy to those 10 OpenShift clusters I was theorizing about. And now this backup policy is available in all 10 of those clusters. And so what I'm able to do is manage as code via deploying from my code repository how backup is handled in those 10 clusters. So rather than having a human log into the Spectrum Fusion GUI in 10 different clusters, go to my backup policies page and create policy in each of those clusters, all I really need to do is do that once, and then I check that file into Git, I deploy it to those 10 clusters, and my backups are automatically just handled in that fashion. So now the people who are dealing with applications such as the SREs in those clusters can determine that maybe, I want to back up, let's say this Cloud Pak for data using my Cloud Pak ops policy we were just looking at. They can self-service based on the policies that I defined and I sent out to those various clusters. And now I have an assurance that all clusters are doing backup in the same exact way using the same set of policies. And they're all backing up ultimately to the same set of object endpoints. And that's all being managed as code and instead of having to do all that manually. The point we're trying to communicate is, yes, management interfaces are kind of nice and provide a simple way to set things up. But also we get these code objects, which are called a custom resource, which is these YAMLs I'm showing in OpenShift's UI. These things always get created anytime we're doing anything in the UI, and then I can manage these kind of programmatically across a lot of different clusters. The same approach that I showed for managing backup as code is also used to manage anything else in Kubernetes or OpenShift in an as code approach. So that's managing backup as code, and make sure and check out all of the other Spectrum Fusion videos that we have.